Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much. Apologies as we've worked through technical difficulties, but it wouldn't be a conference if we didn't have some fun along the way, right? So I have the honor of starting us off today. And I'm going to start us off by taking you just a short drive away from where we are right now to the Zilker Botanical Garden here in Austin. Nestled within that 31-acre garden is the Isamu Taniguchi Japanese Garden. The garden was conceived, designed, and created by Isamu Taniguchi. At 70 years old, he works nearly alone, without a salary or contract, to shape the garden into a beautiful place dedicated to peace that opened to the public in 1969. In an essay explaining the spirit of the garden, Taniguchi wrote, "It is my desire for the peace of mankind, which has endowed this man of old age, the physical health and stamina to pile stone upon stone without a day's absence from the work for the last 18 months. According to a historical biography of Taniguchi published by the city of Austin, in 1942, Taniguchi and his family were imprisoned by the US government in the Crystal City internment camp in South Texas. It was while Taniguchi was in this camp that he learned that the atomic bombs had been used against the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a later essay, he wrote, "It was like the world had come to an end. The radiation from atomic bombs, which started from Picadone, the flash and sound of an explosion, over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, shines in every corner of our skulls, analyzing right and wrong, flying over our heads with the humming sound, becoming a god whip to kill instantly, pressing us to act in repentance." While connecting with so many of you in designing and organizing this conference, I've been thinking a lot about what it means to build a garden to peace in the shadow of the Picadone. And in the panels that follow, we'll hear from an incredible group of activists, artists, and academics that will approach our conference themes and try to answer this question in a variety of geographies and generations. The panels will address the residues of the nuclear and imperial. And so I'm going to kind of skim through all of them. You'll get introductions to each, but we'll start off our first panel today with arts, archives, and the atom, before then moving on to nuclear landscapes, then talking about nuclear colonialism in a more specific register, before finally talking about the intergenerational linkages that we are all connected with in environmental justice and disarmament work. Before I begin, we would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, an ancestral name for what is now called North America. And I'd like to acknowledge the Alabama Coushatta, Caddo, Caritza Comahuro, Cohitla Tucan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Seltor, or Pueblo, and all American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas. I want to thank our conference co-sponsors, Texas Global, the Swedish Excellence Endowment, and Barbara Osher Croatia Foundation Excellence Endowment, the Center for European Studies, Center for Middle Eastern Studies, France UT Institute, Humanities Institute, Charles M. Wilson Chair in South Asian Studies and the Department of Government, Planet Texas 2050, Center for East Asian Studies, South Asia Institute, the Oscar Brockett Center for Theater History and Performance as Public Practice in the Department of Theater and Dance, the Briscoe Center for American History, particularly Sarah Sonner and the volunteers who helped set up the great exhibit of images that Don Harleton will be speaking about, the Program in Native American and Indigenous Studies, Brood Mix, and Texas Physicians for Social Responsibility. And thank you so much to the staff, faculty, and supporters of the Rappaport Center, without which none of this would have been possible. So I'm going to introduce our esteemed moderator for the first panel. Please, Navajo, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Cooper. Good morning, everybody. I'm impressed. We had a reasonably late night last night, and it's nice to see a lot of people here have conference stamina. I think how it's going to work, I mean, we have these high chairs, which I don't really necessarily want to make our panelists sit on for the whole thing. So I think let's call up the panelists, and then if you could stay after your talk, and then we can at least be near each other for the discussion and the Q&A. We're running a little bit late because of technical difficulties. So there's a fabulous description of the panel in your program, which I could read to you, but I think that would be redundant. And then we're going to go in the order of so just read the panel description and imagine hearing it in my voice, because that way we can save time. We're going to go in the order of the panelists in your program. You've got their brief titles, but I'm going to give you a little bit more information about each panelist before they speak. So first, we're going to hear from Don Carlton, who is partly responsible for those incredible images outside, or at least for curating them in Austin. Don Carlton is J.R. Parton Chair in the Archives of American History and Executive Director of the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas. He's lectured extensively on historical research methods and sources, the history of American news media, and 20th century U.S. political history. He has authored 13 books. I'm not going to list all 13 of them, including Red Scare, which won the Texas State Historical Association's Coral Tallis Award, and A Breed So Rare, The Life of J.R. Parton, Liberal Texas Oil Man, 1896 to 1992, winner of the Texas State Historical Association. It won the Texas Institute of Letters Award. In 2015, Carlton received the Texas Democracies Foundation's Bernard Rappaport Award. Before leading the creation of the Briscoe Center, Carlton served as founding director of the Houston Metropolitan Research Center, an urban history archives program sponsored by Rice University, the University of Houston, and the city of Houston. And Don is going to be speaking to us today about Flash of Light, Wall of Fire, Japanese photographers, and the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Don, it's all yours.
Let me get my clock out here, because Janice Ingold told me that they had a big hook that they grab you by the neck if you go over 15 minutes. And I felt that was pretty dangerous, so I wanted to let me make sure that I don't. So anyway, well, thank you, and good morning to everyone. I'm responsible for the technical glitch, because every time I go someplace, there's a technical glitch, and I think that it's something to do with me. But anyway, so the mission of the center that I direct here at UT Austin is to preserve and make available original documents, photographs, publications, and artifacts that serve as evidence essential to an understanding of the American past. Among other collections covering significant, really different topics, the Briscoe Center has an archive of news and documentary photographs, now approaching 10 million images in size, and it includes the entire photo archives of about 100 leading American photographers. It's the largest collection, one of the largest collections in the United States of news photography and documentary photography. Now, this massive collection includes an archive of 826 photographs taken by Japanese photographers of the horrific death and destruction resulting from the atomic bombing in August of 1945, of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the U.S. Army Air Force. You know, frequently, too often, when we talk about the bombing of Japan, atomic bombing, it's, you know, that the Japanese were bombed. Well, they were bombed by someone. They were bombed by the U.S. Air Force. Most of these photographs, a few of which I'm going to be showing in my PowerPoint this morning as I speak, were taken immediately or very soon after the bombing itself. Roughly, or the bombings, I should add, because we're dealing with two cities. Roughly half of the photos in the archive visually document Hiroshima, while the other half depict Nagasaki. It's pretty much an even split. The images in this archive were collected in the 1980s by an organization of Japanese photographers and photojournalists operating as the Anti-Nuclear Photographers Movement of Japan, to which I will refer as the ANPM from this point on, because of a rather lengthy title. As the organization's name clearly indicates, it was created to help bring about the ultimate abolition of all nuclear weapons. Their efforts include lobbying the Japanese government to ensure that Japan will never possess nor manufacture nuclear weapons, nor permit their introduction onto Japanese territory. Their main activity, however, has been to educate the youth of Japan about the horrors of nuclear war by gathering and exhibiting photographic evidence of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the cover of the book that we've published, Flash of Light, Wall of Fire, which includes a selection of those photographs. Okay, let's see, how do I operate this? The next slide, if that works out okay. Accordingly, ANPM's members launched a project to identify and visit with surviving photographers in Japan who had preserved their photos of the after effects of those bombings. They interviewed, this is, by the way, you jump ahead, I think, here. Let me just, no, wait a second. I just want to make sure, this is Hiroshima. This is a photograph from Hiroshima from our book, and from our archive, I should say. At any rate, they located and identified and visited and interviewed these photographers who took these images immediately or very soon after the bombings of these two cities. So that's how the archive was actually created. The ANPM also published the photographs in Japan in a 2-volume set of books. In December of 2017, Hank Nagashima, an English-speaking representative of the ANPM, contacted me by email out of the blue, explaining that he and his colleagues were aware of the Briscoe Center's work in collecting documentary and news photography archives. After identifying his organization and its mission, he stated that he and his colleagues wanted to make a digital copy of their archive and place it at the Briscoe Center here at the university, where they hoped that it would be made available for research and teaching, as well as public education. Nagashima said that if I accepted their offer, one copy of the ANPM archive would remain in Tokyo. You can go on to the next ones. This is also, I believe, from Hiroshima. This is from an army hospital in Hiroshima. So anyway, Nakashima said if I would accept their offer, that this one archive would remain in Tokyo while the other would come here to Austin, and those would be the only two places that they would be available. Knowing nothing about the ANPM or whether they had a polemical agenda of some sort, I was at first wary of their offer. As a historian, I was keenly aware of how controversial the subject of the atomic bombing of Japan had become in the United States. In 1995, I had closely observed the Smithsonian Museum's short-lived plans to display the restored Enola Gay, the B-29 that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. I followed the angry and emotional battle over the exhibit's interpretive texts, which focused on the debate about whether the bombing had been necessary to end the war. After reviewing the two books, the two books of photographs that the ANPM published, and after I did some research about the organization, I was struck by how few of the images that they had collected had been published in the United States. The photographs are remarkable and, of course, document the horrible reality of atomic warfare, about which Americans need to be reminded during this era of nuclear proliferation. Next photographs. This is a photograph taken 15 minutes after the atomic bomb exploded over Nagasaki. So it was obvious, and you can go to the next one too. So it was obvious that the archive would be an important resource for research. Nevertheless, before I began negotiations with the group, I still needed to clarify their agenda. I had no interest in the Briscoe Center engaging in any effort to refight World War II or participating in the endless debate over the decision to drop the atomic bombs. Hank Nagashima, who I learned was highly regarded within the community of professional photographers in Japan, assured me that his organization's only goal was to disseminate the images as a reminder to the world of the dire consequences of nuclear war. I agreed that this goal was one that all rational and thoughtful human beings should share. World War II is over. Nuclear war is now our common enemy. We agreed that the project would be about photographs as historical evidence, which is one of our specialties at the Briscoe Center. And it would also be about the immediate and long-term effects of using nuclear weapons, an issue that has gained new urgency in this moment of renewed nuclear anxiety. Another one, please. As a result, this is also taken in Nagasaki. As a result, I accepted the ANPM's offer to add their collection to the Briscoe Center's archive. In addition, I agreed to ask the University of Texas Press to co-publish with the center a book of images selected from the archive. I also stated my plan for the center to do a major exhibit of some of the ANPM's photo collection in our 4,000 square foot main exhibition gallery in Sid Richardson Hall. The ANPM eagerly accepted my proposal. Most of the committee members ranged in age from their 60s to their late 80s. They wanted the collection to survive them and be available for future generations. After we reached our agreement, one of the leaders of the ANPM, Kenichi Komatsu, sent me a message, quote, "The images are now in your hands. The mission of this movement is to preserve the images and to transfer them to future generations. And we feel that they will be well served with our cooperation." Okay, next one. This is Nagasaki. The ANPM archive is now available for research at the Briscoe Center, which is located on this east side of campus, next door to the LBJ Library. Happily, UT Press approved my book proposal, which led in 2020 to the publication of Flash of Light, Wall of Fire, The title came from a speech President Obama gave actually during his visit to Hiroshima in 2016. As most of you, I'm sure, know, this was the first trip to the bombing site ever made by a sitting U.S. president. The actual title, Flash of Light While the Fire, was quoted by President Obama when he was talking about what happened when the bombs were dropped. Flash of Light While the Fire features a thoughtful essay by Dr. Michael Stoff, the now retired member of the University of Texas at Austin's Department of History. Another contributor is Japanese journalist Michiko Tanaka, a reporter for the Hiroshima Daily newspaper, the main newspaper in Hiroshima, who was born several years after the war, but she grew up in Hiroshima and attended school in the city. Her essay provides us with the perspective of a woman who, as an impressionable youth, experienced the educational and cultural legacies of the bombing. And our exhibit also was opened at the same time as we published our book. Okay, I think we can go to the next one here. This is an amazing photograph. I think it's a Torii gate, as you, I'm sure, realize, and it's in Nagasaki. A physicist would have to explain to me why the gate survived and nothing else did. The ANPM archive is a significant visual documentation of nuclear blast damage and devastation, including the burnt human flesh, the horrific after effects of radiation, and the mass human suffering that resulted. The organization's work to locate and collect and preserve these images was especially critical because of successful efforts after World War II by at least 3 governments to hide them all and suppress them. Very soon after the bombing of Nagasaki, the Japanese wartime military government confiscated as many of these images that they could find and also banned the publication or distribution of any images that they had failed to locate. The military government feared that the images could lead to civil unrest in Japan. Although its basic motive, the government's basic motive, was to continue to mislead its citizens into thinking Japan could still win the war. During the American occupation, this is government number 2, during the American occupation of Japan, the United States government continued the Japanese military government's policy of suppressing the photographs on the official grounds that they revealed military secrets of the United States. Like the former Japanese military government, American occupation forces also feared that these images could lead to civil unrest in Japan. Back in Washington, the Truman administration was concerned the photographs of the bombings would be compared, you can go to the next here, that these photographs would be compared with photos of Nazi atrocities, especially those documenting death camps like Bergen-Belsen and Birkenau. And those photographs were being widely distributed of the death camps and the bodies and this one. So in addition, the administration, which was rapidly expanding the U.S. nuclear arsenal and was preparing to test nuclear bombs in the atmosphere, kept from the public information about the harmful effects of radiation exposure, especially from fallout. An effort was made to persuade the American public to think the atomic bomb was simply a conventional super bomb, just a big, big bomb, playing down the potential dangers of radiation to humans. At a press conference, President Truman even declared that the atomic bombs were similar to the strength of large artillery weapons. When news eventually leaked out about the dangers of radiation, its horrors were downplayed. General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, stated at a congressional hearing that radiation poisoning, quote, might even be a very pleasant way to die. Okay, go to the next one. You can skip that one and go to the next one. This is someone suffering from the radiation and the burns from the bomb. This is at the Hiroshima Red Cross Hospital at the time, which did some of the building did survive. The American public was allowed to see images of the mushroom clouds, which represented the climax of American technology. So those were published immediately. And we were also allowed to hear eyewitness testimony from the B-29 pilots about how it all looked from the sky. However, reports about what had happened on the ground were virtually non-existent. When a few photos were finally released, they were of devastated landscapes. You can go to another one. They were of devastated landscapes, not people. These were not released. The ones that were released were basically ruins of buildings. And this is because these published images generally failed to register deeply with the public very familiar to seeing photos of urban ruins caused by the bombing in European cities, which were widely distributed. These look like just the same kind of bombing. The published photos did not include corpses or horribly scorched women and children whose hair was falling out in fistfuls and their skin hanging loosely off their bodies. Okay, go to the next one. Authorities in the Soviet Union, this is the third government, authorities in the Soviet Union also suppressed news about the bombs because they wanted to downplay, and Stalin did, I shouldn't say they, this is still in the Stalin era, Stalin wanted to downplay the military power that the United States now obviously had, and they did not. In addition, the Soviet leadership, i.e. Stalin, had launched his own effort to build atomic bombs, and he did not want his citizens to be afraid of the effects of fallout, much less nuclear war. I think it's fitting to close with a quote from the late Aki Matsumoto, a founding member of the ANPM, who as a young photographer covered the aftermath of the atomic bombings and took some of the photographs that we've seen in the book. He covered it for a Japanese newspaper. It is amazing to me, these guys, they were all guys as far as we can determine, were out there, I mean, we're talking about within minutes after this, grabbing their cameras and taking these photographs. And he said to me, quote, "It is my hope that people who look at our pictures depicting the atomic bomb devastation will be inspired to talk among themselves to weigh the absolute value of the peace. Our true wish is the day will come when a movement like ours would become unnecessary because of the permanent peace the world has achieved." It's the Briscoe Center's fervent hope that the ANPM collection and our book, Flash of Light, Wall of Fire, will not only benefit research and teaching and public education, but also help in some small way to make Matsumoto's wishes come true. I want to mention also, I don't know how much time I've got left here.
You're a little over, but there's no.
I'm a little over, okay. I'll just quickly add that much of our work was greatly enhanced by a trip that Allison Beck, who is here with me, and Ben Wright went to Japan, and we were hosted by Hank Nagashima, and we met a number of the survivors of the bombing. We met an expert on radiation poisoning, a Japanese expert. And while we're not going to try to claim that we're experts on Japan by spending a couple of weeks in Japan, we came back much better armed to do the work that we needed to do with these photographs. So I thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
We're going to do questions after. So hold your questions for the Q&A. I mean, it's going to be an emotionally taxing morning if you haven't already received that. Okay, our next speaker is Kirsten Cather, who is an associate professor of Asian Studies and director of the Center for East Asian Studies here at the University of Texas. She is a literature and film scholar who focuses on modern Japan. Her first monograph was The Art of Censorship in Post-War Japan, so I can already see links across the panelists. And she's published a range of articles on censorship and suicide in journals such as the Journal of Japanese Studies, Japan Forum, Journal of Japanese and Korean Cinema. She's also the director of the Center for East Asian Studies, an umbrella organization for scholars working in East Asia across UT. She is the co-creator of Japan Lab, which aims to develop a new template for Japanese studies by integrating digital humanities across all aspects of the curriculum. She's recently supervised a Japan Lab digital humanities project on censorship in Japan. But so you could see this, the synergies across our speakers in terms of thinking about how to curate, record, educate, movement build in different digital and material formations. So, Kirsten, it's all yours.
I'm going to work it myself because I've got so many.
All right.
May I suggest, because you're not going to be able to see otherwise what I'm talking about, right?
Okay, I will.
It's just a suggestion. It's a suggestion. Thank you so much for having me at this conference. I start with a confession. I am a worrier. I should have worried more about technology because we had a triple failure this morning. So John took the hit, but really it was entirely my problem. But I'm a worrier, and thus the title of my talk. And after I submitted it, I worried that it sounded too flippant. This is my worry of my worries, right? They've already introduced me, right? So what I teach is Japanese literature, film, and culture. And what I wanted to do is share some of my teaching experiences with you here at UT. I've been here for 19 years. And I start with an unremitting disaster of an experience from 15 years ago. I was teaching Intro to Japan. Some of you may have had the pleasure of these intro survey courses, 80 plus students. This one was at Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 9 a.m. Some of the students cannot locate Japan on a map on day one, and some have advanced work in history and culture and politics. So it's just impossible to teach. For the unit on the A-bomb, I want to show you a series of slides that I usually tended to use. I would juxtapose the iconic mushroom clouds, right? Making sure I had Nagasaki, the oft-forgotten Nagasaki next to Hiroshima. I would cut to what I've always found to be a very disturbing photo, one that simultaneously seems to humanize and dehumanize the bomb by capturing its human agents here. Young men posed for a photo in front of the B-29 that was named after the pilot's mother. I'd shift to scenes of destruction wrought by the bomb, aerial views of Hiroshima pre and post attack. Of course, we'd always have the iconic shot, and I thank Don for showing us the cover of Flash of Light, of what's now called the atomic bomb dome, the Genbaku-domu. And just a side note, as you might have noticed, I don't know if anybody did notice the difference between the photo and the cover, if I could see it correctly there. There's lots of shots like these, right? And I've always preferred a shot with this man in the foreground because I thought it suggested the scale and the human cost. But recently I found out, was surprised to find out that this was not a Japanese survivor of the bombs, but instead an Allied war correspondent. Perhaps it does not matter, but perhaps, as I'll suggest today, it does. So using photos and statistics like these, I try to suggest to my students the enormity of the instantaneous destruction and the terrifying, long-lasting effects carried by victims of the bomb, which required this neologism to be coined. Victim, bomb, person, hibakusha. In the hopes of getting my students also to think about how people on the ground not in Hiroshima might have encountered or come to know about the bomb, I would show them leaflets like this one obviously was in Japanese, but there's a translated version that threatened utter destruction, advocated evacuation, threatened utter destruction unless there was a surrender, and callously point to Hiroshima as Exhibit A. Of course, then I'd have the iconic shot of Nagasaki with the Shinto torii still in evidence. And finally, I'd move to the Emperor's surrender speech on August 15th, where there's yet another depiction of the bomb here. For a second. But dropped by an unnamed enemy, right? And as the speech goes on to show, this has dire implications, not just for Japan, and according to his speech, but also for all of human civilization. I would end, I was hoping to show that the bomb would, like how the bomb stops time in places, sometimes quite literally, but also how time moves on, both in Hiroshima, by these then and now shots, and in Nagasaki as well. And I'd end with those iconic mushroom clouds. Now, what followed in my Intro to Japan class after this for day one of the presentation was an absolute disaster. It was a very lengthy and heated debate among students litigating the war, litigating the bomb, whether it was right to drop the bomb or not. And some in the class were quoting secret documents and statistics and facts, while others were trying to impress upon their classmates the horror, the emotional and physical horrors of the bomb. It left them divided, and in the end, and me worrying. I knew I had set this class up for complete failure. Both them and me totally unequipped to engage in this debate, and for my part at least, very uninterested in doing so. So the bar was set pretty low for how not to teach the bomb after this experience. And I've had some better success over the years, but I continue to worry. I'm a worrier. In my Genji to Godzilla adaptations of the Japanese classics class, it's an upper division. The point is to think through how cultural productions travel through time and space. And while the original Gojira, much to my disappointment, did not really thrill students, and go figure, it's 1954, it's subtitled, it's black and white, it's quite somber. When I juxtapose it with the American remake, Godzilla King of the Monsters, ! It does engage them. Now how many of you have seen both? Minority, right? Calling this a remake is a misnomer of epic proportions, what could be called brilliant marketing feat or very unethical plagiarism. The Hollywood filmmakers basically, but very selectively, took footage from the original 1954 Japanese and interspliced scenes that put Raymond Burr, as Steve Martin, United World News reporter, at the center of all the action and all the moral decision-making about whether and how to kill Godzilla. And I maintain that he bears a very an uncanny resemblance to General MacArthur with his famous corncob pipe, but I've never gotten anyone to agree with me on this. So when I have students watch these films back to back, what they and I most enjoy is their outrage over this self-insertion, this is a word they taught me, of an American into the drama, right? And the film's racial politics and its dubious dubbing practices only add to that outrage. Most useful is the way this juxtaposition forces us to think about how the story of the bomb can and cannot be told in various contexts. So what we find in the adaptation, that's okay. What we find in the adaptation are many moments of Japanese suffering that are muted at the expense of amplifying the danger that the bomb poses to all the world, and to, of course, to our representative stand-in, the hunky American protagonist. I want to just show one example here. This scene appears in the original quite late in the film, after Godzilla attacks innocents. And there its point is to show how witnessing the suffering of women and children, in particular, spurs one of the Japanese heroes in the film, Emiko, to save the day. In King of the Monsters, instead, the scene appears quite early in the film to establish, with a lot of voiceover and interspliced scenes, as we'll see, that crucially put Steve Martin at the center yet again. And then it's about him as an injured person who is brought into this hospital, and who nonetheless goes on to save the day. Tech failure number 3 of the day, yeah? Okay. So by analyzing these films back to back, what my students really see is the difficult situation of when them is us, to borrow from John Noriega's really fabulous essay on this subject. Now, it's not just the hero that's the problem in these films, but the nature of the antagonist too. Godzilla the monster is a very complicated figure in both films, it's interesting to see. He's both a victim awakened from the bomb in his natural environs by H-bomb testing, and an agent of destruction who wreaks havoc on innocents. The bivalent nature of this beast makes it a very tricky film for students. I found that Godzilla is pretty useful nonetheless as a pedagogical vehicle to keep some memory of the bomb alive, especially given the numerous remakes and sequels and adaptations that, as we see, continue to adapt to nuclear crises. But Godzilla also has its limits. For the nature of the beast is not always clear in these generic B monster films, especially I think as audiences become more distant in time and space from the original historical horror at its origin. Now, a 1985 poll shows us that Godzilla is remembered as an epic icon, Japanese icon of sorts. But as the respondents' other answers suggested, Emperor Hirohito and Bruce Lee, who is not Japanese, right? Audience's memory and knowledge may be incomplete, and whether out of benign but lingering ignorance, repression, or censorship of all types. I'm shorthanding my censorship discussion because Don set us up so nicely to see how very censored, especially images of the bomb were. Not images of the bomb, rather, but images of the suffering wrought by the bomb were. And I want to give you this account by an author, Ota Yoko, and a U.S. Army intelligence officer that's illuminating in its own way for what could not be said about what could not be said during the occupation period, right? He came to question her, and she says, well, there's rumors around that only scientific reports can be published. And he says, no, it's not my job to answer. She says, okay, I can't publish atomic bomb secrets, but is it about cruelty or is it a total prohibition? And he says, I can't answer. And he says, I want you to forget the atomic bomb. In a new class I'm teaching for the first time just this term called Banned in Japan, I've found that probing these first-person accounts and the archives that do remain in the face of invisible censorship offers its own very exciting way for students to be active archaeologists of sorts. And I'm really indebted to the many scholars and archivists who have preserved these first-person accounts in translations and works of scholarship and in archives as well. The lens of censorship is a very useful one to engage students, and it's a bit of a cheap trick, I'll admit, right? By stressing what can't be seen or read, they really want to read and see, right? Now, this is a literature and film teacher's dream. So more recently, we've been doing this Japan Lab program, which Neville introduced for us. I won't belabor that point here, but I want to move to show you one example. My students last fall created this game called The Censor's Desk. And the basic premise is to play the role of an impossibly long-lived censor in Japan. So it forces you to be the censor, which is its own interesting sort of positionality. But you live from 1900 all the way until today. And I want to show you the segment they created about Ota Yoko, the one who was in question before by the intelligence office. She has a really fabulously devastating story memoir called City of Corpses that she wrote in 4 months' time after surviving the bomb. She had to scrape together materials, 350 pages, but not pages of manuscript because she couldn't find them, so she used toilet paper and shoji paper from doors. My students were so moved by this that they were very insistent we needed Ota in our game. And this is what she looks like there. Let's see if I go down. Oh, I hope we. So basically, this game forces the students too to think about historical context and legal contexts, and as they're changing from period to period, because they get rules that show them what a censor they should follow or not. They also have to read literature, right? At least excerpts from literature in translation. So here, the censor decides to deny City of Corpses because it is lacking in scientific merit and filled with the kind of gruesome bodies that get censored. What was most brilliant about my students' team was that for key authors like Ota, the player encounters not just a text, but the flesh and blood, or at least a pixelated version of the author in an interview phase. They took from Ota's own published words about her encounters with the censors and her encounters with censorship here, drew from them to have her speak back to the censor, right, to give her life. They then get to redact what they redact, and at a certain point, decide that they've done enough, and she basically says, forget it, I'm done. I won't do it again, okay? What this game, I think, does is it brings to life the difficult body of texts and bodies in the author in a way that I hope will keep them alive. As Beatrice said yesterday, it's something they love to do, right? Play video games, create video games. So by injecting the atomic bomb in here, we hope to do so. Now, in the last minute of my talk, let me turn back to the early disaster of a teaching experience. Here's another leaflet that was distributed after the Hiroshima bombing. Its rhetoric suggests that we can, that in this photographic representation of the bomb, one can see and can understand. And the question I return to in my last moment is what power did or does any representation of the bomb have then or now? In regarding the pain of others, Susan Sontag has written about the ethical and moral difficulties posed by images of suffering, especially in our image-saturated world. She was writing back in 2003. This is undeniably more true today. And I happen to be teaching this Banned in Japan class in the history of building. Just 10 feet from our classroom hangs this photo. A few weeks ago, before we studied the atomic bomb, I surveyed the students. Only 2 of 28 had seen it, though they admitted to passing it every day. They all mentioned how they thought maybe they were desensitized to this all too familiar image. After reading Ota's first-person account and also Hersey's Hiroshima, I asked them to look again and to reflect upon what they saw now. Students' comments were wildly split. Some saw the enormous power of the bomb on par with the divine and natural act. And for others, this was precisely the problem. I love this one in particular, the one that noted that the black and white made it one from so long ago that it seemed wholly unrelated to me. That it tried to overwrite the suffering faced by the atomic bomb. The class was divided and a very lively debate ensued, precisely along the lines of what Don has talked about as one of the central debating points in taking the collection. This time the debate was a welcome one. I could stop worrying because in a sense I had made my problem theirs by asking them to reflect on the powers and limitations of these representations. Their responses were really a teacher's dream. They were reading and seeing carefully, thinking about art and representation, about history and ethics. I'll end with the image that I took in this lovely line. I worried because this image is so grainy with my iPhone 8. I kept trying to retake it to get rid of the glare and the reflection, worried that it didn't capture the original well enough. But I realized that it's perfect for the way it captures not just or only or even the bomb, but the shadowy reflections of me and my students trying to see through the glare. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Okay, next up is Anaïs Mora, who is an assistant professor of French and comparative literature at Rutgers University and a faculty associate at Columbia's University Center for Nuclear Studies. Her research foregrounds how Pacific artists and activists have resisted environmental racism in Oceania from the genocidal epidemics of earlier centuries to the contemporary period of nuclear colonialism and carbon imperialism. Her first monograph, which we're all greatly looking forward to, Pacific Stories from Nuclear Survivors to Climate Activists, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. And her talk today is, and I'm really looking forward to this because I think we need it, The H-Bomb and Humor, the Pacific Arts of Laughing at Nuclear Death. Okay, Anais, it's all
Thank you,
yours.
Neville. Thank you, everyone. Hello. I would like to start by thanking my fellow panelists and the amazing women who presented yesterday, for those of you who were able to attend. Because they really helped us start this conversation by putting at the forefront the emotions that come with talking about nuclear weapons and nuclear testing. I'm very emotional about this myself. I come from the nuclear colony of Mohinui, the islands also known as French-occupied Polynesia, where France detonated 193 nuclear and thermonuclear bombs in the atolls of Moruro and Fangataufa. And it was really wonderful yesterday to listen to the panelists. You made us cry, you made us angry, you made us think, and I'm very grateful for the space you've given for all of us. Since this panel is about arts and archives, I want to start by asking us what we mean by archives and who are the archives for? Who are we talking to? What is the cost benefit of sharing some images? Are they going to help victims of nuclear tests, or are they going to reinforce the trauma? Who has given the authorization to share those images? Is it authorization, when we talk of pictures, authorization by photographs, or authorization by the people who are taken in picture? Who is even we when we say we are using archives? These are very complicated questions, and I don't always have answers, but I want to share that the images and the texts that I will use today have been shared with the authorization of their authors, and they have been shared because these people from the Pacific Islands want their stories to be known, and they think that these artworks, these archives have a healing power for the primary victims of nuclear tests. With that start, let's try to talk about the H-bomb and humor. The text you see on this slide was made in the middle of the Cold War. It's a cartoon that was made in the middle of the Cold War, while the US was trying to locate many of its nuclear weapons in the Pacific, in its nuclear colonies, and in Pacific waters via nuclear submarines. Many Pacific Islanders refused this nuclearization of their homelands. In Fiji, in Guahan, in Palau, in many other, as Betty said, big ocean states, people mobilized actively against this new form of the nuclear imperial complex was taking. And in 1982, indigenous Maori activists from Aotearoa, New Zealand, published this cartoon in their newspaper, Te Hui o Ronga, saying, "This missile needs a home, will you help? This poor defenseless weapon. Nobody wants a poor defenseless weapon in their backyard. In the spirit of volunteerism, can you help send a suggestion to a Pentagon with leaving the viewers to their imagination about where this missile should go?" So this is not the typical anti-nuclear propaganda, nor the typical archive that we use in classrooms that most of the time, or in conferences about nuclear weapons generally. And don't trust me, trust the Australian doctors who founded ICAN. They said, I quote, "The anti-nuclear movement has a chronic humor deficit," end quote. So it's not entirely surprising, because it's absolutely unfunny that nuclear weapons are killing everything and everyone else with militarism. But sadness and anger and revulsion are only some possible mode of action and reaction against nuclear colonialism. And the Pacific anti-nuclear movement in particular offers this other example of fighting with dark humor, with satire, with parody that laugh at nuclear death. And it's particularly interesting that the most virulent anti-nuclear humor comes directly from the most irradiated nuclear countries. For example, in Mohinui, the country where I'm from, despite all the horrible suffering, despite those 193 nuclear and thermonuclear bombs that gave Maori women, along with Marshallese women, the tragic title of having the most thyroid cancer in the world, despite the ridiculousness of this official danger zone that you see in red, that's shaped like a champagne cork, we all know this is not what nuclear fallout looks like. And we see, even in this ridiculous official danger zone, there are inhabited islands. So you can imagine the scope of the devastation in our country. Despite that, Maori artists have turned to humor, have turned to satire to talk about nuclear colonialism. Consider, for example, this painting by André Mariri entitled After Gauguin that he made in 1986. It's a parody of a famous painting by Paul Gauguin that replaces eroticism with nuclear morbidity. And his composition is clearly intended as a parody not only of Gauguin, actually, but of French institutional discourse at the time, because the myth of the sexually available Wahine, the Tahitian woman, was one of the reasons why France actually decided to locate its nuclear testing center in Mo'ohinui. Some high-brass military officials have recalled, and they're quoted in the archives as saying that they decided not to go, for example, over the Kerguelen Islands, which are uninhabited in the South Indian Ocean, but rather to Mo'ohinui, because they thought that the myth of the sexually available Wahine would help recruit the young French military soldiers that would be invited to the center. And in the military brochures, in the military journals distributed by the French to the new conscripts, you could find full page, like scantily clad Tahitian women, page after page after page, with not a single Tahitian man in the entire brochure. So this is actually a parody of French official propaganda. And this painting has a fascinating history. It was acquired by Radio Tefana, the first anti-nuclear and pro-independence radio in the country. And it is made visible to the public. It's not sitting in some private owner's house. Everyone can go, it's in the town hall, everyone can go look at this painting. It was used as the cover of a Greenpeace brochure in 1987, and it was used in many posters by the Victims Association Moruro et Tato. In other words, it is public art. It's a relatively small canvas, but it has become public art. It was so dangerous to do anti-nuclear art at this time. Tahiti has been under a semi-dictatorship under President Gaston Floss for over several decades. Anti-nuclear activists were exiled or blackmailed or physically intimidated. That André Mariri actually did not sign his painting, but this is the beautiful part of the story. He recently added his signature in 2016, and now he can own this piece of public art. It is interesting also to underscore that doing such a form of political public satire in Tahiti in the 1980s was revolutionary for more reasons than it was fighting the censorship. Because you have to know that Tahiti has a rich culture of public satire that thrived from the 16th to the 19th century. When the whole country was celebrating at yearly intervals the public comical theater of a religious group of artists called the Arioi Society. The Arioi Society traveled from island to island to make fun in a ritualized context of the kings and priests, the Ari'i and the Tahua of each island. And their humor relied heavily upon making fun of people in power and innuendo. Case in point. But the Arioi Society was banned by the first European missionaries, and public humor in Mo'ohinui as a traditional art form was lost. So Mariri's work revives here this tradition with his focus on public satire and innuendo. The bomb here reads as a phallic symbol, as if Maohi women were tasked with the burden of carrying French claim to masculinity and military power. And the second woman, you'll notice, no longer holds flowers, but banknotes, suggesting the prostitution of either the woman or the islands. And prostitution was a big problem during the nuclear testing era, both as a metaphor, because the government basically selling the islands of Morura and Sangataufa against nuclear money was seen as the prostitution of the islands, but also because French military men arrived in the thousands in these islands, often outnumbering the local population, leading to sexual violence and a great increase in sex work. So Maori people began organizing and saying, hey, there's too many men in the streets. But the French government saw it differently. There were not even women in the streets. So they decided to create floating brothels in the ports of Papeete, the capital. And they were stopped only by, you guessed it, the high school students of Paul Gauguin High School. So history really reads here both as tragedy and as farce. And it may explain why Mariri was inspired to revive the Arioi tradition of sexually charged public satire. There are many other examples of comical parody. Here, a parody of a very famous photograph by Adolphe Sylvain by Maori graffiti artist Kronos, suggesting that the French don't really have the priorities straight between what should be banned between nukes and nudes, right? There's also many interesting examples from Guam, the nuclear colony in which the US is stockpiling nuclear weapons. For example, this nursery rhymes from poet Craig Santos Perez, who pokes fun at the Americans' lack of experience with mass extinction at the hands of militarism and colonialism. Oh me, oh my, what schools of bloated fish blowed by. Some are predators and some are prey. Who will survive, I can say. And I don't have time to go over it, but the poem is shaped like Shomoru, traditional prayer for the dead, pointing behind, again, you can see that behind the parody, there is tragedy. Behind the tragedy, there is farce. Really, the two can go together and go together in this form of art. I wish I could show you more examples. I analyze many other forms of political satire in my book. But I want to finish by asking the question, why? Why use comedy to talk about nuclear imperialism? And there's many possible explanations, but I think it might have to do ultimately, and that's what's transpired from my interviews with some of these artists, with the desire to heal the communities. It's about making do, it's about making life, it's about making sense again in the aftermath of the apocalypse. As Fijian philosopher Wilsoni Hereniko famously said, humor is a generative force. It's not just recreation, it's recreation. And so much specific anti-nuclear art has been directed at foreigners, to let the perpetrators really know what has happened in the Pacific Islands, to beg the world to care. And in these forms of political satire, they're really made for the community. You have to be familiar with for example, with the history of Tahiti and the Arioi Society and this event with the Gauguin high schools to really understand the multi-layered dimensions of these works of art. So this anti-nuclear humor is a form of art for Pacific people, by Pacific people. Because in the end, nuclear chaos is not the first nor the last Pacific apocalypse. Should be reminded that Pacific people have faced not one, not two, but three apocalypses in the Anthropocene. First, mass epidemics between the 16th and the 19th century that decimated up to 90% of the population. This is where you think like statistics don't mean anything. Imagine 90% of your country who dies of epidemics. Next, the apocalypse of nuclear testing, which we are unfortunately too familiar with, and now climate change. Each apocalypse, I have to go faster, sorry, but each apocalypse has the same underlying cause. It's what Alban Bensa, the French ethnographer in Kanaki has called annihilation racism, a unique type of racism that presupposes not so much the inferiority of a certain category of people, but rather their inevitable disappearance. First, specific people were said to be doomed to disappear with contact with the so-called first contact, then doomed to disappear. The Pacific culture was doomed to disappear with the modernity brought by nuclear testing centers, and now Pacific Islands are doomed to disappear with rising sea levels. It's unfortunate, but there's absolutely nothing that we can do about it. This seems to be the discourse around it. So, these are going to be really my last words. It's time to shift this narrative on its head and to remember that Indigenous people, as Calvert says, are sometimes treated as the last people living in Holocene conditions, when in fact we were the first ones to enter the era of the Anthropocene. Pacific people are at the forefront of surviving, and as Albert Wendt said, have performed and are performing one of the most heroic feats of survival in the history of colonized people. So in the end, the writers and artists from the Pacific Islands who turn to anti-nuclear humor are challenging this imperial world order by juxtaposing annihilation and creation. And they offer the disruptive humor of the H-bomb as a healing process. Their art may serve as a source of inspiration for all of us today who are invested in nuclear justice and in banning nuclear weapons. That's it. Thank you very much.
We've got one more panelist, and then you can open the floor for discussion. Okay, Will, are you? Okay, Will Wilson is Associate Professor of Studio Art at the University of Texas. He is a Dene photographer and trans-customary artist, excuse me, whose art projects center around the continuation and transformation of customary Indigenous cultural practice. So I could already see some interesting possible conversations between you and Anais. His project, Connecting the Dots, is a photographic counter-survey of the over 500 abandoned uranium mines located on the Navajo Nation. He's won multiple awards. You've seen some of these extraordinary photographs, which I think are doing very interesting things to what the law school normally looks like. And we're very, very, very excited to start teaching at the University of Texas. He's going to talk to us today from this long-term documentary and I think sort of trans-customary project on connecting the dots for a just transition. Okay, well, it's all you.
Thank you so much. No.
Can you manage this?
Yes, I can, I think. Hopefully, we'll see.
This is on key heroes.
Okay. I just want to play this one thing while I read this statement that I'm going to talk about, and then I'll come back to some of this imagery. There it is. Okay. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to Neville and Karen and Cooper and Quinn and Caroline for putting this all together, and my fellow panelists, and to the Rappaport Center. As a new arrival to UT, you guys reached out in a way that really made me feel like, I belong in this place, right? And the wow, there are people doing really exciting, interesting things, and they're interested in what I'm doing. So that was very moving to me. So thank you. All right. So about connecting the dots. What can a critical Indigenous cartography reveal about uranium extraction and processing on the Navajo Nation? How does a narration of place through an Indigenous lens offer an alternative vision of who we are as people? The Connecting the Dots project, initiated in 2019, seeks to answer these questions and more as it links geography and history with the cultural imaginary of a community through visual narration. This photographic survey counters and and reconciles traumatic histories of extraction with contemporary indigeneity and our complex relationship to Deneta, our homeland, right? These are not photographs of wastelands or sacrifice zones. They're images of home, a landscape of memories that make us who we are. Dene Bikaya is a land aware of its people. It knows where our umbilical cords binding us to the land are buried and where our loved ones have passed. This land has sustained Dene families for generations and continues to provide for and protect us now and into the future. My life and work are woven into the Connecting the Dots project, perhaps most importantly through my belief that photography is a generative practice that can shift paradigms. Connecting the Dots is an artistic endeavor in the spirit of citizen science that uncovers histories, provides tools, and proposes changes. The counter survey uses drone-based aerial and app-activated photography to help Dene people restory our narrative. One component of the project is a comprehensive study of over 500 abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation, and is currently focused on the more than 100 abandoned uranium mines along Arizona's Highway 89, which is, sort of central to the community that I'm from and grew up in, my part of the res. In addition to recording striking aerial images of huge facilities imperceptible at ground level, drones offer a unique out-of-body experience. Drone photography, which has its roots in surveillance and control, can also be an instrument of counter-forensics used to reveal environmental injustice. The roots of the present situation can be traced to 1942, when shell companies created by the Manhattan Project and later its successor, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, began mining and processing uranium on Navajo lands. Despite the well-documented health hazards, the United States government never warned Dene workers and or their families of the danger, a clear example of environmental injustice and racism. Dene workers and land are considered expendable, or were considered expendable, while the mines were deemed essential for national defense and economic development. Connecting the Dots encompasses additional initiatives. Photographic portraits of frontline community members are anticipated. An interactive mapping app is in development that will show users where they are in relation to the AUMs, or the abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation, and also will consolidate EPA site screening reports, which are available and sort of hidden in plain sight on the web related to these sites. We're also interested in deploying available technologies, hoping to capture the landscape via LiDAR and using 3D modeling to document the current state of these sites. Thus far, the work has been supported by the Native Arts and Culture Foundation, as well as the NDN Collective, underwriters of a collaboration with Dene College, resulting in additional photography, a speaker series, exhibitions, and numerous articles. The Connecting the Dots project will shape a platform for voices of resilience, wisdom, and vision for restorative systems of economy and memory making, leading to a reformed approach to environmental remediation on the Navajo Nation. And so we have a website that's sort of in development that sort of is a place to aggregate all of this information. But I'm going to talk now a little bit about just my practice and how it led me to this project, I suppose. And I'll start with this image, a documentary photograph that I didn't make, that was probably shot in the mid-50s. The image that you were looking at previous was the Mexican Hat disposal cell, where there's an aggregation of 4,400,000 tons of nuclear waste, right, that's been brought to this site and interned there. And it was the site of a uranium processing mill in the Monument Valley sort of region. And it started in 1956. So I'm thinking that this image was also shot around 1956 because the little girl in the foreground is my mother. And, you know, there's just a very like remarkable kind of time shift that has occurred, right? And it's only happened within, you know, a generation. I don't know, people talk about sort of imaginaries and the power of sort of the rhetorical devices of imaginaries. And I don't know, I think this is an example of that in some ways. It's just a different, you know, it's an illustration of a different worldview and how incredibly quickly things can shift, right? So I started doing photography because I was drawn to its sort of storytelling capacity. This in particular story started in 2004, and it was something that I was thinking about in relation to these spaces, trying to sort of reconcile my own feelings about growing up in this region and thinking about it as sort of this site of extraction and processing, right? So this is from a series entitled Autoimmune Response. And it's sort of this, you know, atemporal kind of narrative about this protagonist who's roaming the landscape, trying to figure out where people have gone, how to inhabit it, how to live within this sort of, you know, beautiful but strangely toxic space. It's also an investigation of, you know, my relationship to a Navajo homeland and me thinking about sort of processing those ideas in relation to myself. There's aspects of the Navajo creation story where there are these two warrior twins born of water and monster slayer who make the world habitable by defeating these monsters, right? So that sort of flows through the narrative. By the end of the first iteration, the protagonist, you know, feels like, oh, it's, you know, it's important to build a home, to live in this strange new world. So that's what's going on in that space. And then, so this has had many lives. Most recently, and I'll show some images later, it's become sort of a research facility, but this was its first iteration. You know, I'm interested in how artists are really good at like imagining solutions to complex problems, right? And so in this image, our protagonist is now working on like cultivating indigenous food species and thinking about how to terraform, you know, this space, but like on sort of an industrial scale. This is the actual air lab with you know, cultivating indigenous food species. And then, you know, there's a shift from this sort of imaginary or speculative practice to something that feels a little more real world, and it's sort of this counter survey in some ways. And this is the Connecting the Dots map that identifies the locations of the abandoned uranium mines. And Highway 89 runs on the far left of the screen, right? From about Flagstaff up near to the city where I grew up, all the way up to Page. There's over 100 sites along that stretch. And that's kind of the current focus of the survey at this point. So I'm sure we'll get to talk about a lot of this stuff soon, but I'm just going to show you quickly some of these images. This is not my photograph, but it is the site of a uranium processing mill, which is 4 miles outside of Tuba City, Arizona, where I grew up. And when I was a kid, you know, doing adolescent things, this was sort of a kind of important site to go check out as one of the only sort of post-industrial spaces that we would go, you know, hang out in. Now it's a super fun site. And this is what it looks like, right? My children, thankfully, have not experienced any strange abnormalities genetically. But, you know, I mean, one of the things that that's really important. Water is life, right? And many of these kind of sites are very close to critical, aquifer or like above ground water sources. This is only like half a mile from the San Juan River. This site is in Shiprock, New Mexico. This is the last remaining traditional sort of processing site in the United States. And it's 2 miles upgrade from the Ute Mountain reservation, right? And it is an example of how drones can actually, function to be able to image this kind of stuff in ways that you can't see from the ground, which is kind of exciting to me in this practice. And then, just briefly, the EPA has, in collaboration with the Navajo Nation EPA, has done site screening reports for most of these sites, but they're kind of hard to find. You have to know the name of the mine that was named in like the 50s or 60s in order to kind of drill down to get to the site screening report. So that's where the app comes in, right? There's sort of critical information about like the amount of radioactivity on ground in these sites. And there's some good information in these. But again, it's not very publicly available. So the app that we're working on is going to be based on a database that coalesces all of that information and shows you in real time where you are in relation to these sites, right? There's also a speaker series associated with this in collaboration with Diné College, which is the tribal college on the Navajo Nation. These are some of the supporting organizations, and this is the app that I was mentioning, which is in development. We haven't deployed it yet, but it's getting close. And it's built on Mapbox, which is sort of a platform that like all trails or a number of like mountain biking apps are associated with. But we are thinking about sort of a digital commons as a space to sort of aggregate multiple layers, thinking about GIS in relation to this practice. What else can I leave you with? And then there's the practice here. Like I had the opportunity to show this work at the Visual Arts Center a few years ago. Kayla Shadeen was the curator of this as she was kind of finishing her PhD studies, and she's been a wonderful collaborator to work with. And so this is sort of the latest iteration of the autoimmune response laboratory, right? And in this case, at the University of Utah, we were working in collaboration with a nursery there that was sort of focusing on research around phytoremediation, plants that can absorb heavy metals from the ground and sort of clean the soils. So, yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, can I ask our panelists to come and sit on the high chair? We, of course, are running slightly late. And I feel bad because it's, there's a lot of hard feeling and difficult feeling and profound feeling that circulates around these presentations. And that we don't really have time to do them justice. Because we're in institutional time, and we're in academic institutional time, which is a terribly repressive mode of time. So what I'm going to do is it's terrible when the first panel runs late because then you get the domino effect. So we are going to go until 10:50, cut into your coffee break substantially. Or actually, you've only got 10 minutes for coffee, so drink fast. And then the next panel will convene only 15 minutes behind schedule at 11 o'clock. Did I get that right? And it's back here. Okay, so I had a series of questions that I wanted to ask all of you, but I think it's important to open it up to the audience because I see lots and lots of hands and enthusiasm. So what I want to do is I want to collect 3 questions because there's not going to be we don't have sufficient time, so I'm truncating. So questions for the whole panel, questions for individual presenters. Let's collect 3. Okay, Ian, I saw your hand up. And then...
What date do you use for the advocacy, and how did the photographers learn to protect their film?
What, I'm sorry.
What date do you use for the advocacy? I use Trinity, and how did the photographers learn to protect their film from radiation?
Okay, 1. Question 1. Question 2. Yes.
Oh,
yeah. Okay.
Colorization. I'd like some pros and cons about, especially the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki. What some of the debates about, or if they even have been colorized, just to observe what impact or differences,
Are you talking about changing the actual photograph? I mean, could you say?
Having it colorized.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. Number 3 for this round. Yes.
I'm really interested in Will, your artwork and thinking about expanding it to other communities across the United States that are dealing with radiation exposure, like in the RECA Act that's going through Congress at this moment. I know in St. Louis, which is a part of this bill. So I was wondering if you had interest in expanding it to other communities that are dealing with uranium and radiation exposure across the United States.
Pick one, go.
Well, let me just answer the question about the photographs. I mean, these photographs, from what I understand, because I'm naturally the information I have is 3rd and 4th hand, because we didn't deal directly with the photographers, except in a couple of cases who were members of the ANPM, and we dealt directly with them. But in their survey, I mean, they literally, they went all over the place in Japan trying to find these photographs. Some of them knew that families had hidden them and that sort of thing. It's hard to answer how they protected them because we didn't have direct contact with them. There is a real touchy, sensitive issue, however, about messing with the images. Some of these folks consider these images to be sacred, and they shouldn't be mucked with. And we've gotten that. Allison, would you agree with that? Allison Beck over here was with me in Japan and worked very closely with it in this whole project. So, we were literally told by the ANPM, don't mess with these images. And so, they are what they are. And it's a miracle actually in some respects that most of these even sort of exist. But mainly because of what I said earlier about it's still amazing to me that all these people had it together enough in this catastrophic situation where there's literally a mushroom cloud going above them and fire and everything else, and getting a camera and going out and taking these pictures. That stuns me. Anyway, I will not monopolize the time here.
I mean, I would love to expand. There's a lot to deal with within, Navajo just in and of itself. But I'd love the app to function as some kind of platform that could be reproduced. And I'm just thinking about RECA in general. I mean, there's so many sort of claims that haven't been made for people on the res, just because people didn't speak English, there wasn't a paper trail. It was like cash receipts. People were working sort of, in a very itinerant mode. But if there's a way to sort of like use the app as a space to coalesce some of that narration, then potentially, I mean, a lot of people have been working on that kind of stuff already, but, if it can be part of that process, yes, for sure.
Okay, I think so. That you got the impossible answer.
It might be a little bit of a fruitless debate. Some people date it to the beginning of nuclear testing. Some people date it to the invention of the whatever machine it was in England. Some people date it to the invention of agriculture. I think maybe the more pressing question is when are we going to get out of that era and into the next one? And this is where, as Betty was saying yesterday, the correlation between fighting the nuclear industrial complex and fighting climate change really go hand in hand. They not only have the same effects, they also have the same causes, and we really need to have a radical approach in the etymological sense of the word, like tackling the root of the problem. So yeah, let's place bets on what the next geological era should be called. Maybe.
Okay, Eddie, I'm sorry to point. Livia, okay, and then Annalise. Some of you I know, but I can't read the things. Okay.
So mine is going to start with a comment and then perhaps a general question. I live in Tempe, Arizona, so seeing Will's piece reminded me of you didn't mention it, but the awful juxtaposition of Terrell's earthworks, which is another kind of earthworks compared to the ones that you're showing. Yours is so much more profound and meaningful and grounded. But James Terrell probably is more famous in some ways because of what he's trying to do with that space, and it's protected in so many different kinds of ways. Just the opposite of what you're doing. So it feels, for me, that juxtaposition just kind of blew my mind a little bit. But I think the other comment I want to make is perhaps in terms of the general framing of especially the first couple of presentations, which is that is it time that we moved away from talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese experience, as being purely an American encounter? And I'm thinking particularly of the Indian soldiers who part of the British Army who came into Hiroshima a day or two after the thing and were the first to clean up what was this devastated nuclear site. Letters from them appear in Indian newspapers as early as January of 1946 and become part of the story that other people are telling around the world about what this means. And it's not that the US-Japanese encounter isn't important, but I think that if we don't see this as global from the outset and trace the ways in which it meant something to people, we talk about the Pacific, but we don't talk about the Chavos Islands, and I think it's time now to kind of break away from those old ways of thinking and adopt a new global perspective and think about it, both incredibly local and grounded, but also planetary in scope. Comments?
So I have a question for Anais, and I know nothing about the Pacific, but yesterday I listened to Becky, and now I listen to you, and so I'm interested, and I saw that you have a book up there called The Ocean on Fire, Stories from the Pacific Islands, and I'm like, I might look at that and read it. So I wonder, is that a book primarily for a literature department community? Does it talk a lot about Derrida and that sort of stuff, or is it readable for general?
Okay, hang on, we're collecting one more. All right, I know that's a very good question. All right, Annalise.
So thank you so much. This was an incredible conversation. Absolutely stunning. I was really moved by Anais's invocation of humor, and I wanted to ask you all to talk about beauty, because I was really struck in Don's photographs, and again, Will's photographs, how just shockingly beautiful they are. And Anais, you're working against the text of the pornographic nature of that kind of beautification of the situation. That's again for us, right? And so I'm just wondering if you're obviously doing something really interesting around and with beauty itself. And I wonder if you could just talk about that and how you think of it in light of that history of the way in which the beautification of violence has been part of the way in which the violence is treated.
That's something you probably wrote. Yeah.
I'll go first on that. Just sort of those last slides that I had to go through pretty quickly. I think for students that became the key question for them, that beauty and that terror of the image and what to do with that, right? And for me, it was really wonderful to see them saying, on the one hand, it's a gross display of imperialist power and colonialism, right? And war. And on the other hand, it's beautiful. It looks like art to us. And what do we do with what, right? Sort of, I throw it in their laps, that question of the beauty. The question that Iddy raised, I'll just sort of as a Japan person, yes, no, and yes. no. I mean, right? yes, and absolutely. And I think that, but I do think when I'm talking about it from the student perspective, for teaching American students here in Texas today, I have to start with this question of America and this question, for me, I have to start with Japan for obvious reasons, right? But inserting America into this, right? But I like your idea of then how to push beyond that, right? And I've pushed beyond to East Asia, and I've never thought of really pushing past that. So if you can point me to translations of those beautiful, right? These are ways that we can, my students then can access those as well.
Okay, my book is for a general audience, but I want to say if you are interested in specific anti-nuclear activism, you should read books by Pacific Islanders, by the people who've been impacted, because sometimes it feels like everything's been said for 50 years. Why do we have to keep repeating this? Looking at the first testimonies already tells you most of what you need to know. So I would recommend Why Haven't You Known? Pacific Women Speak Out. I would recommend in Maohinui, if you read French, testimony by anti-nuclear activist John Doom, Eno Tetao, Mémoire d'une vie partagée. And going beyond, there's a huge problem in anti-nuclear activism where experts sort of monopolize speech, especially in the United States. It's easier to access my work than the work of the artists themselves. So push the libraries to acquire copies of the artworks, push the libraries to acquire copies of the poems, and really stop looking to this intermediate class that is many of us in this room. And to answer Annalie's question, it's such a beautiful and powerful question. And I just have an anecdote that I would like to share with you. In Papeete, capital of Tahiti, there's a memorial for victims of nuclear tests, a set of 3 unu, traditional sculptures by Eriki Marchand. And I asked him, why are your sculptures so beautiful? This was so tragic. And he said, well, it's not only an accusation to France, it's also a memorial to the victims. And in that sense, the art that I make has to be beautiful. So again, this is about holding together all these contradictory aspects. I was talking earlier about tragedy and farce. Here we talk about suffering and beauty, and that's the nuclear fact. And I think art is a wonderful way to bring it all together and to help us process those contradictory feelings.
There's a great exhibition called Exposure that's been traveling around in a book that focuses on sort of indigeneity and some of the effects of nuclearity in relation to that, and it focuses on, the indigenous voices and stories. So, and then, beauty, that land is beautiful. It's our home, it's not wasteland, right? Despite the fact that it's toxic or that it's been poisoned, I don't know. Yeah, contradiction is definitely.
I think the level of public awareness about particularly your work in your area of the country is pretty, that needs to be really more widely spread. I think that most people in this country, I have no statistics we haven't done any polling on this, okay? But I really do believe, I'm very familiar with that part of the country, and most people see Monument Valley and Shiprock, and they don't understand what's in between or around it at all. And I think that going back to this whole idea about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but yes, it is a world story, no question about it. This is a good example, with the whole idea of radiation. Is such a huge topic, and it is a worldwide. You're talking about the Marshall Islands, and you're talking about a lot of work's been done on the Marshall Islands, hydrogen bomb testing and so forth. But on the other hand, when we say, why do we keep talking about this, is because every generation has to be taught. We're not born knowing this stuff because somebody else talked about it before we were born. So this is our job, is to unfortunately continue to recycle what seems to us to be obvious because we've learned it. But we've got whole generations coming up where this stuff is lost to history, frankly. And the level of I'm a historian. I pay close attention to this sort of thing because the Briscoe Center exists to do this. And it's appalling to see the level of ignorance and misinformation about all of this stuff. It needs repeating. And this is the folks on the anti-nuclear photographers movement. This is their view too, because they have the same situation in Japan. It's one of the reasons they went out and got these photographs. They feared the new generations, the younger generations of Japan were going to, this is history. This is a long time ago. It's not, it's not our story, whatever. And that's one of the reasons that they wanted these photographs preserved.
All right, I think.